was asked to address Rabbi Lichtenstein's position on the issue of Kedushat Shabbos and some of the halachic issues that come up with regards to Kedushat Shabbos. I was privileged to hear a shiur from him, a long shiur from him on this subject, and of course it's been written up now in great detail in the Sefer Kedushat Aviv, which came out from his writings and so on and so forth. I'd just like to go through some of the main points as it reflects upon Kedushat Shabbos, and especially stress one chiddush, I believe, that Aharon developed in this regard. It began with a statement in the Mishnah Megillah that says that Ein bein Yom Tov l'Shabbos, there's no real difference between Yom Tov and Shabbos, ela ochel nefesh b'lvad. The only difference in terms of Shabbos, in terms of halacha between Shabbos and Yom Tov, is matters relating to ochel nefesh. Ochel nefesh means, broadly defined, matters relating to preparation of food. We all know that on Yom Tov it's permissible to prepare food. You're allowed to cook on Yom Tov. There are various restrictions with Rabbanan about making fires and so on and so forth, but one is allowed to cook and do other things related to food preparation. On Yom Tov and on Shabbos is not allowed. This, of course, is not the only, despite the language ein bein, it's not the only difference between Shabbos and Yom Tov. There are other differences. Rashi and Taubes there in that daf discuss it. Another prominent difference with regard to punishment. The onesh for violating, the punishment for violating Shabbos is not the same as the punishment for violating Yom Tov. A person violates Shabbos, so this is a capital offense. One can get, under proper circumstance, one can get skila. If one violates b'shogeg, you bring a korban chatos. That's not true about Yom Tov. For Yom Tov, you get malchus. You get lashes like violating other Yisrei lav that are in the Torah. So, okay, it's not a question the Gemara said. It's only explaining there's no difference in terms of what's permitted and what's not permitted. Doesn't mean that that's the only difference. We all think of other differences in davening. There are many other differences. Doesn't mean these are the only differences. But what Lichtenstein wanted to explore is what's the nature of these differences. And why is there such a difference, or why are there such differences between Shabbos and Yom Tov? So regarding ochel nefesh, regarding the permissibility of preparing food on Yom Tov, which is allowed, as opposed to preparing food on Shabbos not allowed, what's the core, what's the reason behind it? And Lichtenstein, Kedarko, kind of divided up into two possibilities, two different ways to look at it. One, and he quoted, the appropriate people who suggested one way or the other. He said, in Yom Tov we have a specific mitzvah called Simchas Yom Tov. One is required to rejoice on Yom Tov. We understand that part of Simchas Yom Tov is rejoicing by eating, by drinking. That's part of Simchas Yom Tov. The Ein Simcha Lebabasar Yayin and so on. So having fresh food on Yom Tov contributes to Simchas Yom Tov. The Gemara has a number of places that if we're not going to allow this, Osilim Nuyim is Simchas Yom Tov. You won't be able to fulfill the requirement of Simchas Yom Tov. And that could be, from one perspective, I think he quoted the Shagasari like that, the one perspective, Simchas Yom Tov, the requirement of Simchas Yom Tov is what motivates or what inspires the idea that preparation of food is allowed on Yom Tov. Why is it not allowed on Shabbos? So one could argue, again, two ways. Lichtenstein pointed out. On the one hand, you could say there is no mitzvah of simcha on Shabbos. We have kavod Shabbos, we have oneg Shabbos. Do we have a mitzvah of simcha Shabbos? And that itself is a dispute, but according to at least one position, there's no particular mitzvah of simcha on Shabbos. And for another time, we can discuss the difference between kavod and oneg as opposed to simcha. But there are those who say that since there is no mitzvah of simcha per se on Shabbos, then there's no heter of ochel nefesh, because ochel nefesh is motivated by the requirement of simcha. The heter to cook and prepare food on Shabbos, on Yom Tov, is motivated by the fact that it's a mitzvah of simcha on Yom Tov. If there's no mitzvah of simcha on Shabbos, you don't have the permission to cook on Shabbos. However, there are other sources which indicate that there is, in fact, a mitzvah of simcha on Shabbos as well. In which case we have to go back and wonder, well, why then is ochel nefesh, preparation of food, not permissible on Shabbos? So there, Lichtenstein suggested it's because perhaps Shabbos is a more stringent prohibition. Because Shabbos carries with it a punishment of skila, it's a capital offense, a death penalty if you violate it. So Simchas Yom Tov, it's not enough to overweigh or override that requirement. The prohibition of Malach on Shabbos is a stronger, more powerful prohibition than on Yom Tov. So whereas the prohibition on Yom Tov can be overridden by the issue of Simchas Yom Tov, even if one would insist that there is a mitzvah of Simcha on Shabbos, still it's not enough to allow for preparation of food. That's one way to look at it. If you look at it that way, there's no real fundamental difference between the prohibition of Shabbos and the prohibition of Yom Tov, or the permission of ochel nefesh and the prohibition on Shabbos of ochel nefesh, right? It's not a fundamental difference. It's kind of almost a technical difference, either because Yom Tov has the mitzvah of simcha associated and Shabbos doesn't, or even if Shabbos does, but the nature of Shabbos being more stringent, so therefore it's a technicality and simchas Yom Tov doesn't override it. But There was another way to look at it. And Lichtenstein, I think, preferred this approach, and it's really something developed by the Ramban. He pointed out in a few places in his commentary on the Chumash, and that is that there's a fundamental distinction in the way the Torah presents the general prohibition of work, what we call work, on Shabbos as opposed to Yontif. The term used with regard to Shabbos is melacha. Find it in Aseret Dibros, for example, Ten Commandments. It says, Lo saseh chol melacha. Right? It says melacha. Okay, by Yontif, the term used frequently in Parshas Emor is called meleches avoda lo sasu. Not melacha, but meleches avoda. And the Ramban is sensitive to this, again, in a couple of places, in most detail in Parshas Emor. But the Ramban writes there's a difference between meleches avoda and melacha. Melacha is more encompassing. Melacha is broader and really prohibits any kind of work. Again, broadly defining work, creative work, and so on, as opposed to meleches avoda, which is only a certain type of work, but leaving out other type of work, which is not included on the meleches avoda, and therefore permissible in Yontif. And what the Ramban calls meleches hanoah, something which you get direct benefit from, and so on, like cooking food, because you're going to eat the food, that was never included in the prohibition of Yontif, of melacha and Yontif. That's why the Torah does not use the word melacha with regards to Yontif. And the Ramban points out there actually is one place where the Torah does use the word melacha with regards to Yontif, and that's with regards to Pesach in Parshas Bo. It says, Kol melacha lo yaseh b'hem, and it's dafka there, the pasuk goes on immediately and says, asher yachal l'chol nefesh v'levado yaseh lachem. It's dafka when the Torah does use the word melacha regarding Yontif, Pesach is a Yontif, it goes on to say, yeah, but not ochel nefesh. Right, so that sort of touches on a very fundamental difference between what's prohibited on Shabbos and what's prohibited on Yontif. It's a very different formulation. It's a different set of rules for Shabbos and Yontif. It's not just, like we said before, some kind of technicality based on Simchas Yontif or based on the fact that Shabbos in general is more stringent than Yontif, but rather a more yesodi, a more basic distinction between Shabbos and Yontif. Lichtenstein then noted that there is another difference in terms of culpability for violating Shabbos as opposed to Yontif, and that is what's called Zdon Shabbos. If a Zdon Shabbos for Shigas Malacha. Let's say we don't go into all the details right now, but we know that there are 39 forbidden categories of Malacha on Shabbos. Many of them apply to Yontif too, others don't, as we've suggested. But when it comes to Shabbos, let's say a person realized that it's Shabbos, but he committed various different, engaged in various different malachas by mistake. He didn't know that you're not allowed to write, he didn't know that you're allowed to plant, you're not allowed to sow, you're not allowed to whatever it is. And he knew it was Shabbos, just made errors regarding these particular, many different activities. Malacha is, don't Shabbos for Shigos Malacha, right? It was amazing in regards to Shabbos. He knew it was Shabbos. Not that he forgot it was Shabbos. Right? There's a difference. Let's say I forgot that it was Shabbos. I totally forgot. And I turned on a light, and I wrote somebody a letter. I just forgot that it was Shabbos. Here he knew that it was Shabbos. I just didn't know. I remember, just to interrupt myself, I remember reading once in the biography of Rishon Zaman Arbach, Zichron Baruch, of whom Rav Aharon, Zichron Baruch was very close, especially towards the end of his life. Rishon Zaman was a young man. He grew up in the Shari Chesed neighborhood in Yerushalayim. And apparently, I read in the biography, there was an extra room in the house that the parents, Rabbi Shlomo Zalman's parents, he was a young man, he was a teenager, his parents rented out because they needed the income and so on, and they rented out to a Jew who had come over from the Soviet Union, from Russia, and wasn't observant. And they made an agreement with him that he can rent the room, but they said, we understand you're not observant and so on, but in the house, when you're in the house, we ask you not to please not do anything prohibited on Shabbos. When you go out on Shabbos, you go wherever you go, you do whatever you do, that's your business, but here in the house, you shouldn't do. And he agreed. And the way the story was related, that Mrs. Auerbach, Rabbi Shlomo Zalman's mother, was walking by that person's room and he was writing a letter to somebody. And she was a little upset because that was in violation of the agreement. So she called her son, Shlomo Zalman, over, the teenager, and said, please speak to the fellow. He made an agreement, and, he's not keeping to the agreement. Could you please tell him that he shouldn't be writing on Shabbos? So Shlomo Zalman knocked on the door, went in, and he started to tell him, and the guy was extremely apologetic. He said he never knew he not allowed to write on Shabbos. Came from the Soviet Union. He was so apologetic. He wasn't trying to break the image. Just never heard that you're not allowed to write on Shabbos. That was the Soviet Union at that time. But in any event, that's called, he knew it was Shabbos, don't Shabbos, Shigas Malachas. So halacha is, you have to bring a korban for each and every different one of the malachas. Chilik malachas is what it's called in technical language. Chilik malachas, each malacha is considered separate. That's not true by Yontif. By Yontif, you can do several different malachas. B'shog, you don't have to, there's no korban altogether, but there's not on Yontif because you only bring a korban chatas when the violation, if done on purpose, would have been a capital offense, which it wasn't by Yontif. But again, you don't find this same distinction. So why is that? Why is it that when it comes to Shabbos, each melacha can be looked at as an individual act, an individual violation, whereas in Yontif, no matter how many different melachas that are prohibited in Yontif you do, it's still considered one single violation. So Rabbi Lichtenstein said again, he said, because it could be, it relates to the korban aspects, a detail within korbanos. Since by Shabbos there is a korban if you violate a melacha b'shogeg, by accident, so therefore we'll look at each one separately. Whereas when Yontif there is no korban anyway, it could be a detail within melacha. On the other hand, getting back to what we said before, Rabbi Lichtenstein suggested that maybe it's because there's a fundamental difference. There's simply a different definition of violation of Shabbos as opposed to violation of Yontif. And what he pointed to was, and this is, his tremendous breadth of knowledge, and he'll pull things from different places, which when you hear it, it's so obvious. Why don't I think of it? Okay, he quoted psukim from the Torah, which all of us have seen multiple times and didn't necessarily think of it in that way. He pointed out that, Shabbos is introduced to us early. Well, of course, we have in Parshas Bereshis, the Kadosh Baruch Hu rests on the seventh day, but no prohibitions are mentioned there. We have prohibitions of Shabbos introduced in Parshas B'Shalach and the Parsha of the Mon, that they weren't allowed to collect any Mon on Shabbos and so on. There'll be a double portion on Friday, but they had to prepare everything in advance. So we find a little bit of Hilchos Shabbos there. In the Aseret HaDibros, of course, Lo Saseh Chol Malacha, Parshas Mishpatim, Shabbos is mentioned, but it never mentions anywhere in those earlier sources that it in fact is a capital offense. That's not introduced until Parshas Kisisa. In Parshas Kisisa, toward the end of Sheni, the first Aliyah is a very long Aliyah. So we have the psukim at the very end of that Aliyah, which most people have the minute to say by Kiddush on Shabbos day, V'shomer b'nei Yisrael as Shabbos, and so on. That's where the psukim are found. But there we find the term Mechalaleha Mos Yumos. That's the first time in the Torah that we find that there's a chi of misa, there's a capital punishment if you violate Shabbos. Why is that introduced first over there? And it's introduced with the word Mechalaleha. One who violates Shabbos is a chilul. Okay, what does chilul mean? Chilul means a desecration, right? That's not introduced. We don't find that as Dibros the concept of chilul Shabbos. We have the phrase, we throw it around all the time now. He's mechalal Shabbos. Mechalal Shabbos, mechalal Shabbos. Person is mechalal Shabbos. Okay, but, it's a term we know, but it's not introduced in the Chumash till they're talking Parshas Kisisa. So why should that be? And evidently, the chi of Misa, right, the stringent treatment of violation of Shabbos is a result of the fact that there is a chilul which takes place when somebody violates Shabbos. Why is it introduced over there? So Lichtenstein noted that we know that the second half of Sefer Shmos is primarily about the building of the Mishkan, collecting all the materials for the Mishkan and building the Mishkan and so on. What exactly is the Mishkan? The Mishkan is the Beis Hashem, right? We build the Mishkan to have a place for HaKadosh Baruch Hu Shechina to dwell. Okay, that's what the Mishkan is about. And it's going to be a place which radiates or represents Kedushas Makom. Right, there's a special place. And we know, the Torah tells that all of the Bnei Yisrael eagerly participated. They gave so much, to the Melachas and Mishkan that the Moshe Rabbeinu has to say enough already. I was saying in my shul that, I think that's the only time in history of fundraising where the chief fundraiser said, okay, no need to give any more. We have enough. I don't think that ever happened again. At least certainly not often, but it happened in Chumash, right? Moshe says, I have enough. He tells us, he lets word out in the camp. It says in Parashat Vayakil, don't bring any more. We got enough. So everybody's excited. And we understand, of course, in Parashat Shmini, happens to be as we record this, we read this yesterday, the excitement when the Mishkan was finally opened for business on Rosh Chodesh Nisan, according to most authorities and so on. So we're excited, and it was a great sense of the specialness of this place, which of course is replicated when they build the Beis HaMikdash in the days of Shlomo HaMelech, right? The excitement and so many korbanos are brought and so on. It's a wonderful thing. Everybody understands this notion of Kedushas Makom. That is the ultimate in terms of relation with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Lichtenstein pointed out the Ramban develops a notion that tries to explain the notion that in Chazal, the book of Shmos is nicknamed Sefer HaGeula. Sefer HaGeula. The English names that we have for the books of the Chumash are not a translation of the Hebrew names that we use for the books of Chumash. Bereshis does mean Genesis, it's true, but Shmos means names, it doesn't mean Exodus. Okay, Vayikra means he called, doesn't mean Leviticus. Okay, but Midbar means in the desert, doesn't mean numbers. And Deuteronomy, the Dvarim means words or things, doesn't mean Deuteronomy. Where the quote-unquote English names come from, that's from Chazal's nickname. So Bereshis is Bereshis, but Shmos is called by Chazal Sefer HaGeula, Exodus. Vayikra is called Leviticus, pertaining to Levi, to the Kohanim, but Chazal called it Torah's Kohanim, right? By Midbar, it's called by Chazal Chumash HaPekudim, Numbers, book of Numbers. And Dvarim is called by Chazal Mishnah Torah, the second Torah, Deuteronomy, it's in the Greek, right, meaning the second. So that's where the names come from. So Sefer Geula, the Ramban notes, that's good for the first half of Chumash Shmos. Right, the whole story of being slaves in Mitzrayim, and then Yetzias Mitzrayim and Kriyas Yamsuf, and we can include us, the Seres HaDibros, because that was the goal of Yetzias Mitzrayim, and we can throw in Parshas Mishpatim because that was just a continuation of Seres HaDibros. Yeah, but what about the second half? Truma, Tetzaveh, Mosta Kesisa, Vayakel, Pekudah is about the building of Mishkan. What's that got to do with Sefer Geula? Ramban said, no, what real Geula is to come back to the level of the Avos in terms of a direct relation with the Shekhinah. That's why it's called Sefer Geula. So people understood that. People understood that's what the Mishkan was. So Lichtenstein suggested that once people could grasp Kedushas Makom, this isn't just an ordinary place. There are going to be rules of who can go where, right? We know that only the Kohen Gadol could go into the Kodesh HaKadoshim, and only Yom Kippur, and so on. And only up to this point, someone who's Tameh couldn't go. And only up to this point, someone who's Tar, but is a Yisrael, only he can go only up to here. And up to here, Kohanim can go. We have all kinds of rules as to the Kedusha of the Makom, and people understand that. People understand there's a sanctity of place, if you will. Once people grasp that, then there can also be a notion of Kedusha Zman. They perhaps were not ready to appreciate the notion that there's, in the realm of Zman, of time, there's certain special times where certain things can and cannot be done. The people were not necessarily sensitive to that as fully as once they were involved in the building of the Mishkan and establishing a place for HaKadosh Baruch Hu Shekhinah to reside in the realm of Kedushas Makom. That's what Shabbos is. Shabbos is the realm of Kedushas Zman, like Mishkan, the Beis HaMikdash, is in the realm of Kedushas Makom. I'm going to interrupt. I did not hear this from Lichtenstein, but I'll throw it in anyway. Okay, I lose from I saw it in the Sfas Emes. So, but I think it's relevant. At the beginning of Shabbos, we sing Shalom Aleichem, many people. And there's all kinds of literature, which verses you should or should not say. Many people say, Tzeis Chem L'Shalom at the end. Tzeis Chem L'Shalom means goodbye. They just got here. What are you saying goodbye? Shalom Aleichem, you greet the Malachim, and 25 seconds later you say Tzeis Chem L'Shalom. Where are they going? They just arrived. It make more sense to say Tzeis Chem L'Shalom by Havdalah, right? So Hashem suggests that, when Yaakov Avinu had his dream, he was leaving Eretz Yisrael, he was running away. He had a dream with Malachim going up and down the ladder. Rashi says in Chumash, who was going up the ladder? The Malachim of Eretz Yisrael. Who was coming down the ladder? The Malachim would protect him in Chutz La'aretz. At the end of the Seder Vayetzi, the reverse. Machanayim, he comes back to the place. What does he see? He sees Malachim going up. Those are the Chutz La'aretz Malachim, and now Eretz Yisrael Malachim come down. So the Sfas says, just as in the realm of Kedushas Makom, there are different Malachim. That's why in Eretz Yisrael he had these malachim, in Chutz La'aretz he had other malachim. So too in Kedusha's Zman. We're saying hello to the Shabbos malachim, we're saying goodbye to the weekday malachim. Interesting approach. But be that as it may, Rav Lichtenstein said, just like we have with regards to the Mishkan, okay, the notion of Mechalaleho, and he pointed to the psukim in Parshas Chukas, which describes somebody who's Tameh. Right, that's the beginning of Parashat Chukas, talks about the Paraduma. He describes somebody the Torah describes someone who's Tameh, who goes into the Beis HaMikdash. You know what the pasuk says? Ki es mikdash Hashem timei. You go into the Mikdash and you're Tameh, you have defiled the Mishkan, the Mikdash. Meaning it's not just a Maisa Isser. Sometimes we have an Avera, in Rav Lichtenstein's terms, right, in the halachic terms, it's a Maisa Isser. I do something which is prohibited. I eat something non-kosher. I eat chametz on Pesach, whatever it is. It's a Maisa Isser. Does it have a broader impact? Well, Rav Lichtenstein said, Alpi Nistar, in Kabbalah, it has a cosmic effect, but do we have it in Alpi Nigla, right? Does it have any broader effect? I did a Maisa Isser. He said certain things do. He said that's what the pasuk is saying there in Parshas Chukas. Ki es mikdash Hashem. The Rambam writes ki just means, the Ramban rather writes ki means kasher, when. But Lichtenstein said no, maybe ki means because. Because this is such a severe isser, because you have defiled. When you're mechal something, it's not just you did a maisa isser. You defiled something. You've been metame something. So he says, just like in the realm of Kedushas Makom, we have this notion that somebody who's Tameh and enters the Beis HaMikdash is not just on a Maisa Isser. He has defiled the place, he has desecrated the place. So too when it comes to Shabbos, and that's where Shabbos is different than Yontif. Okay, Yontif is important, we love Yontif, we don't take away from Yontif. When it comes to Shabbos, that's the notion. That's why on Shabbos, it's a more severe Isser. That's why we speak about Chilul Shabbos. In the slang, we also speak about Chilul Yontif, but we don't find the expression in the Torah. We find Mechaleleh in terms of Shabbos. We don't find Mechaleleh in terms of Yontif. And Yontif is a Maisa Isser. It's a bad thing. We don't do it. Don't try this at home. Okay, but when it comes to Shabbos, that's why there's a Chiyuv Kares. Because you've done more than a Maisa Isser. That's why there's Chiluk Malachas. You're separate violation of each and every thing you did, because each and everything you did is another pagam. It's another attack. It's another weakening of the kedusha of the place. It's true. It was an accident, so I have to bring special korbanos, korban chatos, but I have to bring a separate korban chatos for each one, because if I wrote something and then I planted, then I tied something, and I whatever else I did, I cooked, whatever other Avera did, each one is, so to speak, a weakening, if you will, of the. Each one is a different kind of pagam in terms of Shabbos. And that's why it brought other riots to this as well. And that's why the whole concept of chiluk malachos, okay, is rooted in the pasuk in the beginning of Parshat Vayakel, Havara lechalak yotza, according to some, is because, again, only after they understood this with the Mishkan in terms of Kedushas Makom could they relate to it with Kedushas Man. I think that's in a nutshell what the Lichtenstein tried to stress with regard to Kedushas Shabbos. He had other proofs and so on, but the idea is that the violation of Shabbos is a pagam, it's an attack, it's a desecration, it's not just a Maisa Isser. And with that, the various other things fall into shape. I just want to mention, of course, we don't want to examine Shabbos only from the point of view of violations and malachas and so on. We have, of course, the mitzvah say of Shabbos also. I remember when I was in the yeshiva, so Lichtenstein, they would rotate Shabboses, right? Who was in the yeshiva for which Shabbos and so on. And apparently, and not apparently, he was right, the singing of the Zmiris, there were certain typical Zmiris that we sang, each Shabbos. And apparently it was getting a little bit schwach, the singing wasn't good and so on and so forth, and there wasn't enough intensity. Anyone who met Rav Lichtenstein knows everything in terms of Avodas Hashem was intense. He meant it, he felt it, and he wanted to convey that to us also. It was all intense. Shemir Shabbos was intense, including singing the Zmiris. Now, Lichtenstein, I don't think had he had many, many talents. I think having a good voice was not one of them. He was not a singer. I remember times some hearing read the Haftarah and so on and so forth. He was not a great singer, but nevertheless felt the importance of Zmiris. And I'll tell you what he said that particular Shabbos. He got up and he mentioned, he was trying to give us Musar that we weren't singing well enough in the yeshiva by Shabbos. And he said, there is a position that the Zemer called Tzur Mishalo, which includes a reference to all the brachas of benching, of Birchas Hamazon. So some people don't want to sing Tzur Mishalo on Shabbos because maybe you yotze the rise of benching by saying Tzur Mishalo because you've covered the points that Birchas Hamazon covers. You've covered all you'll think of the stanzas, the verses of Tzur Mishalo. So all of the, all of the themes of benching Birchas Hamazon are covered in Tzur Mishalo. So therefore, there's some people who have the position that you want to, when you bench, Birchas Hamazon, of course, the mitzvah deraisa. So you want to fulfill the deraisa. If you're going to sing Tzur Mishalo, maybe you did the deraisa before. Okay. So he said there are some people. So he said, is there a gzeira that you shouldn't sing other zmiros otu Tzur Mishalo? Right, we have a language of Chazal. There's a gzeira. Sometimes Chazal prohibit A, lest you come to do B. So he said, are we not going to sing others' mirrors? Some people want to be makbid, not to sing Tzur Mishalo. So therefore, we shouldn't sing others' mirrors either, because maybe you'll come to say Tzur Mishalo. That was his humorous, gentle way of chiding us that we should sing Zmiris with a little more slavas. So certainly, anybody who saw Aharon, who heard him make kiddush, when he made kiddush Friday night in the Chadarochel, it was just, you saw the intensity of the person. He experienced the Kedusha Shabbos. He conveyed the Kedusha Shabbos, not just in the halachic realms we just discussed in terms of, what's prohibited and what the nature of the prohibition is, the notion of chilul, but also in the positive sense. And, I think that's what he wanted to convey to us. And, successfully, I think, that he wanted us to feel the Kedusha. In Hasidic and other literature also, we find that one of the differences between Shabbos and Yontif is on Yontif, and with this I'll finish, on Yontif we go to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. In Shalosh Regalim, we go to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But on Shabbos, HaKadosh Baruch Hu comes to us. Boi Chala, we come out, we greet Shabbos, welcome Shabbos into our lives. And one certainly saw that Rav Lichtenstein again when he made Kiddush, just the kavanah and just the thought, the intensity. He experienced the kedusha. And again, this is some of the ideas of kedusha from a halachic perspective. But he also had this tremendous impact upon us in terms of sensing the kedusha as well, which I think to him was very, very important. Thank you.